Finally, this decision ends the unfair practice of admitting students based on their race and allows more students to be admitted based on if their parents went there.
Stephen Colbert weighing in on the Supreme Court ruling this week that upheld the state of Michigan's ban on affirmative action. This latest decision has even traditional supporters of affirmative action talking about new ways to achieve the same goals. We're going to dig into that debate after more on the court's decision from ABC's Ryan Smith.
In a 6-2 decision, the Supreme Court said Michigan voters can keep their 2006 constitutional amendment barring race as a factor in admissions to its public universities. Speaking for the court, Justice Anthony Kennedy insisting, quote, "This case is not about how the debate about racial preference should be resolved. It is about who may resolve it."
It's fundamentally wrong to treat people differently based on the color of your skin.
But in a blistering 58-page dissent, Justice Sonia Sotomayor said the court's decision did exactly that, saying, quote, "A majority of the Michigan electorate changed the basic rules of the political process in that state in a manner that uniquely disadvantaged racial minorities." And, say advocates of affirmative action, stacked the deck against minority college applicants.
Minority students who want to argue in favor of affirmative action have to change the state constitution.
Sotomayor has called herself a product of affirmative action.
If they didn't open their doors to me, I would have never gotten to where I have.
The question now, will affirmative action policies soon be a thing of the past? Do you think other states will follow Michigan's lead?
I think this opens the door. I'm not sure how many states are going to walk through that door.
Already, 5 other states have similar voter-approved measures banning race-based affirmative action programs, and the impact is staggering. At Michigan State, with affirmative action, up to 10% of new students were African American. Without it, the number falling to just 5%. For This Week, Ryan Smith, ABC News, New York.
And here to discuss all this, Professor John McWhorter of Columbia University and Sheryll Cashin, professor at Georgetown Law, has written a new book called Place Not Race, A New Vision of Opportunity. Professor McWhorter, let me begin with you. When the ruling came down, you wrote in Time magazine that it's progress we should celebrate. Why?
Very much so. Affirmative action is very important, but the issue is what we affirm. And if it's about race, then if we're talking about a long time ago when it could be said that being black was essentially to be disadvantaged, then I was all in favor of a system where you changed your sense of what standards were in order to acknowledge what had gone on in the very recent past. And even today, if you're talking about everybody has qualified in the same on-paper ways and then you assemble a class based on diversity, I get it completely. But if the idea is to change standards, which is what's been discovered at many schools, I think that it's come to a point where that should be about disadvantage. And today, that's not only about race, it's also about socioeconomics. And I think that it's time to move on to that conception, which will take in people of color as well as other people who've gotten a bad hand.
And Professor Cashin, you make a similar point in your book, Place Not Race. You support diversity, you've supported affirmative action, but in your book you say it's time for change, time to focus on place, not race. What does that mean?
Well, everybody who lives in America knows that where you live heavily determines what kind of opportunities you have. And I'm arguing that affirmative action should be based on structural disadvantage. Those high-achieving kids who overcome their having under-resourced neighborhoods and under-resourced schools need and deserve a leg up in admissions because they're competing with kids who have the best of everything. And those who come from poverty-free havens don't need and deserve a leg up. Your kids and my kids don't need and deserve preferences. So I'm arguing that colleges should focus on the structural obstacles that kids had to overcome. And I'm also arguing they need to scrub their admissions process of practices that reinforce advantage. Standardized tests should be optional. Aid should return to being based on financial need, not merit. Legacy preferences should be scrapped.
So you don't get a preference because your mom or dad went to the university. But you know, we have seen what's happened when some of these affirmative action bans have been put in place. We have the state, UC Berkeley, 8% black before the ban, 2% black afterwards. Florida State, 12% black before, 7% afterwards. How do you respond to critics who say, you know, you might have the right idea, the ideal, but it's just not going to do the job?
Well, there are things that we don't hear. And so, for example, after the ban on racial preferences, the number of black students at UC Berkeley and UCLA went down and went way up at, for example, UC San Diego, a fine school, and other ones like that that are considered not on the level of UC Berkeley and UCLA, but really good places to go to school, and more black students graduated. And so I think that that's very important. I wouldn't want to tell the people at UCSD that somehow that's lesser. What we have to think about is not whether race matters, which we know that it does. Many
Some
people
reminders
think that
this week.
decision, right. We've seen race mattering a whole lot, and I think that both Professor Cashin and I can say that in our lives it matters. But the issue is how much in 2014, and whether the fact that race matters means that we should have the kind of racial preference programs that change standards. I don't think that's an easy
And Professor
question.
Cashin, you close your book with a moving letter to your own boys where you write, I would trade the benefit to you of affirmative action for a country that does not fear and demonize people who look like you.
Well, right. I think part of what brings me to this place is that we're a broken country. Our politics is broken, and yet we have this rising inequality. And I'm arguing that it's time to be about pursuing policies that encourage cross-racial understanding and coalition building rather than discouraging it. And I think focusing on place and other barriers can help all people who are on the wrong side of the track and who are struggling come together and coalesce.
Start of an important discussion. Thank you both for joining us this morning.